Hi, everyone. This is Catherine at Hispanics in Philanthropy. I see that people are quickly joining, so we're going to hold off just a minute or two until we have a full house, and then we will get started.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. This is Catherine at Hispanics in Philanthropy. Welcome. Various people are still joining, so we're just going to give people 1 or 2 more minutes, and then we will get started. Okay, let's begin. I'm Catherine Mancera. I'm the Director of Communications at Hispanics in Philanthropy. Thank you all so much for joining. We're really excited to get started today, and wanted to welcome you on behalf of HIP and our partners, the Women's Funding Network and the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy. We're all co-hosting the event, which is being put on by Arabella Advisors in San Francisco. As you all know, right now, especially being able to effectively evaluate advocacy is hugely important for the funders community. And in a moment, Julie Slay, who is Arabella's evaluation practice lead, and Loren McArthur, who's a director at Arabella and the former deputy director of civic engagement at NCLR, will share their perspectives on how to effectively evaluate advocacy, both from the outside and the inside of an organization. Thank you, Loren and Julie. They will present for about 40 minutes, and that'll be followed by a Q&A session. But if you have questions throughout, please feel free to type them into your questions box, and Loren and Julie will pause at several places to answer those questions. With that, Loren and Julie, please take it away.
Thank you, Catherine, for that introduction. Welcome to our webinar today. We're excited to share our experiences evaluating advocacy. But first, we want to thank Hispanics in Philanthropy and Change Philanthropy for hosting this webinar and giving us an opportunity to speak with you today. We also want to take a moment to do a little bit of a deeper introduction of myself as well as Loren, and talk about kind of why it was that we wanted to talk about advocacy, both from the perspective of funder as well as from inside grantee organizations. So first, we come from Arabella Advisors. This Arabella Advisors is a philanthropic consulting firm. We provide strategy and evaluation services among a number of other types of support services for individuals, families, corporations, and institutional foundations. I lead the evaluation practice at Arabella as its Senior Director of Evaluation. We provide a broad range of evaluation services, from evaluation frameworks, theories of change, logic models, through to other types of more summative and outcomes evaluation and everything in between, including developmental, formative, and process approaches, as well as learning partnerships and building learning cultures within foundations. I also, we wanted to include Loren McArthur on this webinar to talk about evaluating advocacy, because he provides a lot of insider knowledge given his prior experiences before joining Arabella. So with that, I'm going to have Loren introduce himself and explain that. Loren?
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Julie. Yep. So prior to Arabella, I spent about 15 years leading community organizing, advocacy, and civic engagement initiatives. I oversaw civic engagement programs and issue advocacy campaigns at National Council of Raza, and also spent several years leading community organizing group in Massachusetts. So at Arabella, I have been involved in evaluating advocacy initiatives, but also have a lot of experience working in advocacy organizations, kind of understand and eager to share some of the challenges to evaluation from the perspective within those organizations. We wanted to start with, so we're going to dive into the presentation now, and as we mentioned, if you have questions, you can put them into the chat box. We'll pause a couple of times to take questions during the presentation, and then hope to have 15 to 20 minutes at the end for more open-ended Q&A. We wanted to start with a definition of advocacy, which is a term that can have a lot of different meanings. This is the definition we use, and the main point here is when we talk about advocacy, we're referring to policy and systems change, not other forms of advocacy that are focused on helping individuals. And advocacy can be focused on advancing public policies, targeting the government for governmental reforms, or it can be focused on reforming private sector policies and practices. So why is advocacy important? First, the funds that can be leveraged through advocacy from federal, state, and local governments dwarf existing philanthropic giving. As a point of reference, the philanthropic sector accounts for about $300 billion in annual giving. Institutional foundations are only about $50 billion of that, $300 billion. As a point of comparison, the federal budget, federal spending is nearly $4 trillion. So there's a big potential multiplier effect for investments in advocacy. A good example of this, I think, is healthcare reform, looking at healthcare reform efforts. Atlantic Philanthropy is one of the leading, probably the leading funder that supported healthcare reform. It invested about $26 million in healthcare reform in the effort that ultimately led to passage of the Affordable Care Act. For its part, the Affordable Care Act will generate $1 trillion in new public spending on healthcare over its first decade alone. So that's a much greater return on investment for Atlantic Philanthropies and the other funders that supported that effort, and if they had simply chosen to invest the $26 million directly into health services. Second, advocacy can lead to systems change. And on many issues, progress on many issues requires changes to laws and institutions. Investing in direct service programs isn't sufficient. The issue of mass incarceration is a good example. The injustices and inequities linked to mass incarceration can only be addressed through fundamental reforms to the criminal justice system. You need to reform policing practices and policies, change overly punitive sentencing laws, reform laws and policies that bar formerly incarcerated individuals from access to housing and services and jobs. All of that requires policy reform and systems change. You can, in fact, make a case that in almost every issue that funders care about, whether it's health, education, racial justice, poverty, the environment, you name it, policy and systems change is really a significant component to making progress on those issues, and that requires advocacy. So for all those reasons, advocacy can lead to greater impact than focusing investments solely on direct services or other types of programmatic interventions. So advocacy is important, but evaluating advocacy is challenging for a number of reasons. First, policy change is a long-term process. It can take 5 to 10 years to achieve significant policy reforms at the state or federal level, sometimes even longer. When the ultimate impact that you're trying to evaluate takes years and years and years, the challenge is how do you measure progress in the short term? Most funders don't simply want to write checks to organizations and then check back in 10 years later to evaluate whether they were successful. So there's a challenge of how you come up with interim measures of progress for a long-term process. But coming up with those short-term metrics can be tricky because advocacy is so dynamic. So we often focus on tracking tactical outputs and activities that can show that a particular advocacy campaign is mobilizing large numbers of people and gaining momentum with the public. But tactics are fluid and they need to be allowed to adapt to changing circumstances. And for evaluation purposes, it's hard to measure a moving target. So just to give a hypothetical example, let's say there's a coalition working for immigration reform, and they plan to pack town hall meetings during the recess to call on members of Congress to support comprehensive immigration reform. So they set a target of mobilizing 5,000 people to town hall meetings during the recess. But members of Congress decide to start canceling these town hall appearances because they don't want to be, they don't want to face their constituents. So the coalition decides to switch to a different tactic, and it decides to generate calls into the in-district offices and kind of melt the phone lines down. So it doesn't meet its goal of mobilizing 5,000 people to the town hall meetings. So when you're evaluating advocacy, you need a way to account for these types of shifts, which are really linked to the dynamism of advocacy campaigns, and a way to distinguish a failure of a group or a campaign to achieve a set of planned or targeted tactical outputs, how to distinguish a failure to achieve those outputs from what may simply be a smart and strategic shift in tactics due to changing circumstances. Another challenge to evaluating advocacy stems from its complexity. Successful policy change involves multiple factors and processes. So when you do get a big victory or a big new policy is enacted, it can be hard to really untease and discern what the critical interventions and strategies and organizations, which ones were pivotal drivers of that success. When you get a win, everybody sort of wants to come out of the woodwork and take credit. So how do you actually identify what led to the success? And understanding that is really critical for drawing lessons for the future. Another challenge is about data collection. You can only track and measure data that groups are gathering, but advocates vary in their capacity to collect data, and creating data collection systems or collecting data can be burdensome for organizations that have a lot of things that they're working on, particularly smaller organizations. What I sort of encountered this challenge personally when I was at National Council of Raza. We created a tool for assessing the advocacy capacity of our affiliates, which were Latino-serving nonprofit organizations all across the country. And we built in all kinds of metrics into this tool. We asked the organizations how many volunteers they had. We asked them how many full-time staff equivalent staff they had working on advocacy efforts. We tried to track the amount of tactical activity, how many phone calls they were making. And what we found is that many groups simply just didn't track this information. And for small nonprofits, it was hard to set up the systems for tracking. And we didn't have the capacity to work sort of hand in glove to help dozens and dozens of these organizations set up these tracking systems. And this links to the final point I want to make about the challenges of evaluating advocacy, which is that data can be fudged. What we found was, when we asked groups for data that they didn't have, they felt kind of compelled to guesstimate numbers that really weren't accurate. And another thing that can happen is when a lot of emphasis is placed on a particular metric, it creates incentives for groups to kind of fudge the numbers. An example of this, from my experience, is in voter registration initiatives. Donors that are focused on increasing civic engagement have often been very focused on supporting voter registration campaigns and initiatives that have a low cost per voter registration. This makes a lot of sense. If you have $1 million or $5 million you want to give out, you want to do that in the most cost-effective way and get the biggest return on your investment. But it also created a lot of unintended consequences, and it created a strong incentive for groups to fudge. When I was at the National Council of Raza, we were very focused on estimating costs down to we used to say the last paperclip. But the reality is that there's no sort of audited accounting of these expenses, and so it's relatively easy for groups to leave out overhead expenses and sort of artificially deflate their numbers. So that's another challenge to look out for. So that's at least some of the challenges that are attendant to evaluating advocacy. And it's challenging, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. So we are going to talk, and Julie will now talk about some of the best practices for evaluating advocacy initiatives that can help address some of these challenges using some real-world case studies.
Thanks, Loren. Before I move on to that, does anybody have any questions? I noticed there's nothing in the chat box, but we do want to give an opportunity to kind of pause, take a breather, and handle any questions that folks may have. Okay, so I don't see any typing, so I will continue to move us along. Let's talk about measuring advocacy. So as Loren mentioned, I think you did a great job at first kind of explaining why is it that folks are investing in advocacy, what are the benefits of it, but also what are the challenges when we look to evaluate how effective that advocacy is. And so despite those challenges, we still continue to measure it. It's still important for us to understand what's working, what's not, and when. And so our recommendation, of course, is that when you do that, we first suggest that you think about your theory of change or the framework that you use to drive your investments. So how we go through a process of talking to our funders about how they think change is going to happen, what activities are going to produce the change that they want to see, and most importantly, what exactly is that change and how might you go about measuring it? And how might we create a system to measure that process and progress along the way, given the challenges that we just talked about? So I want to share an example of a framework that we built to summarize a set of investments and assumptions of one advocacy-related program. So as you can see here, let me just walk you through this framework. This framework reflects thinking around how this particular funder was interested in going from inequitable school policies that had serious and negative outcomes for students to more equitable education practices and policies, so that we could see fewer disparities in suspensions and expulsions, particularly for students of color and boys of color. You can see underneath, so we've got this organized into two phases, phase 1 on the left and 2 on the right. Phase 1 focusing on setting the stage in order to get folks ready for policy change. And the one on the right is to get folks ready to implement those policy changes. And you'll see below a number of tactics that can be measured through either outputs or outcomes, through qualitative and quantitative metrics, but it shows you kind of the assumptions that they're making about what's going to work. So they suggested educating decision makers, building and mobilizing grassroots organizations, engaging in diverse allies, building public will, fostering and disseminating research, as well as creating support networks would collectively help to really create the field and create states and local districts to be ready to adopt, to change and adopt better policies. This framework was incredibly helpful for us as evaluators coming into the work to not only understand the assumptions that the funder was making, but also a way in which we organized how we would evaluate the diverse set of grantees that they had in their portfolio in order to be able to address all of these tactics. And it was also important for us to understand the context in which this sat in, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But we were very interested in the extent to which each grantee was doing these activities and how were we going to go about measuring them, and measuring them in a way that was not burdensome or overly costly. So once you have established your framework of how you want to influence change, the next step really is picking the right indicators. Now, of course, picking the right indicators is not something that's simple. You have to have a pretty good sense of what it is that you're investing in and how they're going to go about doing it. And so what we thought we would do is to provide a few examples of indicators that we're familiar with and that are readily available in the field. And just to kind of pause for a moment, at the end of this deck, we have a set of resources that you can access free of charge through the web that provide a number of examples of different and common indicators used to measure a variety of different advocacy strategies and tactics. The field of evaluation and evaluating it for advocacy has been around and been developing for about 20 years now. So there's lots of good examples and good indicators to choose from. It really is about understanding which of those indicators best reflect the work that you're investing in. So one example that we would like to talk about are building stronger coalitions. So one piece of the work might be to build coalitions in order to influence others for a variety of reasons. And examples that you could use in terms of indicators are looking at the collaborative actions that organizations in the coalition take together. So how often are they meeting? How often are they aligned in strategy? Are they partnering in certain events? These are things that you could collect from a single grantee, or you could collect from an outside evaluator. And again, it's often more qualitative in nature than quantitative, but it can be a helpful indicator of understanding how this coalition is being built, what are the outcomes of those activities that are serving to bring folks together. One other indicator for building stronger coalitions is improved alignment of partnership efforts. So this may be shared priorities, shared goals, a common accountability system. Oftentimes we use a qualitative method to understand that. So it could be, taking a sample of the coalition, or if it's a small enough coalition, interviewing all of its members to get a sense of what their perspectives are around the priorities and the goals of the coalition itself. You can also use a survey methodology and incorporate both qualitative and quantitative data to gather that information. Another example of an advocacy tactic would be mobilizing communities. This was one that was reflected in the framework that I just shared. One way to do this is to just count the number of new advocates that they've mobilized. This is a common output that's used to really understand how an organization is growing the community and how it could affect and mobilize it. You can also ask organizations to count the number and type of actions that have been taken by the advocates that they've pulled together. And so that, of course, can be collected, again, through either qualitative or quantitative methods, but it really gives a sense of how they're engaging with that community, how they're going to mobilize them, and how much participation they have as a marker of success. And the last example we'd like to talk about is around advocacy capacity building. And this is, for those of you who may not be as familiar, this are investments in organizations to help build their strength as an advocacy organization to do a number of different tactics. And so if you're investing in advocacy capacity building, it's important to know what exactly you want to build. What capacities do they have, and what capacities do they need to work on? And so some examples here are improved media skills. We see the use of digital media is kind of all over the map, and oftentimes technical assistance is a great way to help improve those skills, and that can be something that you measure, as well as improved ability to obtain and use data. So again, these are common metrics that folks have used, and again are readily available through different publicly available papers. So one of the things, though, that we emphasize when we're selecting indicators is to be mindful about when and why you're measuring. We talked a bit about the framework and having that be a guide to inform what it is you're interested in looking at over time. But we also know that context is critical for understanding whether advocacy activities are effective. So some tactics may produce short-term outcomes, but just monitoring those outcomes independent of what's going on around it may render useless data. So for example, we were doing some work for a communications campaign. This particular foundation was investing in a large-scale communications campaign, both state-based and national, to protect the repeal of a policy central to the foundation's success. We started out, and this was kind of driven by the funder, to track paid and earned media, Facebook likes, Twitter shares, and report it on a monthly basis in an aggregate way. And so we, of course, saw, and there's a simple graphic here just to get the point across, over time we just saw this growing, month after month after month. This was a long-term investment. This was, by 18 months in, it wasn't useful data anymore. We knew it was just going to keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So one solution to that was to think about the data in context. And so, in its context. And so what a more effective measure would have been is to report on paid media, earned media, and the like, but doing it in a way that took into consideration different communication strategies. So maybe they changed their messaging. Did it go up or down in terms of Facebook likes or Twitter shares? And really starting to understand those media metrics in relation to the actual programmatic activities that the organizations were doing. And this is far more effective data. This becomes effective for both the funder to know what's working, but also, as importantly, for the advocacy organizations to know what's working. And evaluation can help to provide those kind of data. But in order to do that, it's not just selecting an indicator, it's really creating and understanding the context in which those things are happening so that you can enhance that indicator to be more informative and reflective of the work that's going on. So I'd also like to share an example of one particular organization that we were working with that really took advocacy evaluation seriously from an internal perspective. So this was a foundation that was making numerous advocacy investments across a number of different issue areas, both domestically and globally. And they started to ask the big question, are advocacy investments making a difference? They had a strong desire internal to the organization for outcomes data in order to drive their strategy. They wanted to know what was working so they could reinvest or invest in something else. They also, though, recognized the incredible limited capacity of grantees to report data. So as Loren had mentioned earlier, advocates often are trying to be opportunistic and responsive to the world and the environment and may shift and change tactics and strategies as they see fit in order to make the greatest difference. However, what comes with that nimbleness is also potential for not having enough resources to be tracking data and to be tracking some of those pieces. And so this particular foundation was aware of that nature of advocacy and wanted to appreciate that limited capacity of grantees. They also knew that there was some limited buy-in on the part of program officers to push evaluation. They knew that evaluation was expensive, or at least there was a perception that was expensive, and needed to be sure that looking at the right data would be most helpful for staff. But in the past, the types of data that their advocacy grantees were reporting just didn't seem to be helpful. So what did they do about it? They first built a theory of change. And so much like the framework I shared with earlier, they tried to map, and they did so successfully, the advocacy strategies that they were interested in investing in, the ones that they thought were going to make the biggest change and influence others to act. And they focused on areas like political support, financial commitments, and public will within this theory of change. They then created strategy-aligned outcomes. So the foundation itself spent some time thinking about, if we invest in a strategy, what kinds of outcomes would we expect to see in the intermediate? So not in necessarily short-term outcomes, but what would we see in a year or two time? And then lastly, they partnered with their grantee to develop the metrics. So essentially what they did was they started to provide technical assistance using an evaluation specialist that was in-house and contracted in order to work with the program officer and the grantee organization to develop an evaluation framework that made the most sense, that reflected the activities of the grantees, that offered flexibility to those grantees as they shifted tactics and activities, but that also were directly aligned with the outcomes that the foundation wanted to see. And part of that technical assistance was actually sharing the theory of change and sharing those strategy-aligned outcomes with the grantees so they understood what role they played in the bigger picture for their funder. And so one of the takeaways here that I want folks to walk away from this presentation with is that one shouldn't be afraid of outputs as outcomes, nor should one be afraid of partnering with the grantee to get really clear about what your expectations are and figure out what is the indicator that they can report on or that they need help reporting on in order to get you the data that you need. We also want to emphasize the fact that when you are doing any kind of field building or you're doing some work like research and communications, much like the example I gave you, outputs and counting can be just as important as those outcomes that you would want to see in 5-10 years' time. So having research available to policy writers and policymakers, that may be counting the number of papers, knowing how many constituents are signing up to be part of an event where they're protesting might be an output, but it helps to give you a sense as a funder that some progress is being made toward an end, and knowing what that end is incredibly important. So I'm going to pause before we move on into best practices and methodology to see if anybody has any questions or wants to type in a question in the chat box. Nope. Okay.
Julie,
so
I actually
with that,
see a couple questions that were typed in a little while ago. So one says, I would add one challenge to evaluating advocacy, which is looking at the difference between attribution versus contribution, related to a point mentioned previously in challenges. It's important, especially for social change advocacy work, as many contribute to this change.
Absolutely. You know, I think that the attribution-contribution conundrum exists for all kinds of evaluation, not just advocacy evaluation. You know, I think that we think about the attribution-contribution tension when we talk about context. We know that advocacy strategies don't happen in a vacuum, and we know that individual tactics usually are not responsible for a significant outcome. And so to the extent to which an evaluation can bring in the context and show how dynamic the environment is, can help to eliminate that tension between attribution and contribution. It becomes very obvious quickly when you start to appreciate the context that it's mostly about contribution and less about attribution. That's a very good point.
Thank you. Next we have, what kind of overlap do you see between engage diverse allies and educate stakeholders? Seems like a danger to educate stakeholders in phase 2 and not phase 1.
Yes, so you're referring to the framework that we developed. So this framework was very much reflective of both the ideas that the foundation had as well as the kinds of investments that they were making. It was also about trying to reflect the movement that we were kind of evaluating this work within. So that movement is the school to prison pipeline movement. I think that what we found, given the types of investments that they were making and the assumptions that they were making, this reflected their approach. Now, whether or not it's the right one or the wrong one is kind of up for debate, but this certainly reflected their thinking about how they were trying to achieve outcomes. And so our work was to essentially assess both what the grantees were doing as well as what those outcomes were to see whether or not this particular framework stood up over time.
Thank you. 2 more questions. The first is, the indicators that you shared had to do with tactics. What about indicators at other levels, e.g. outcomes?
Yeah, so these were just some examples of those tactics, but we could certainly kind of look to other types of advocacy work that produce those longer-term outcomes. For example, when you're investing in policy advocacy and you are trying to influence policymakers or trying to influence influencers, you may look at outcomes like, you know, folks voting in support of certain bills or legislation, or changes in attitudes toward that, or remarkably, individuals who are on record as being opposed to an issue stop getting on record. So maybe they're no longer speaking against an issue, but they're also not going out and speaking for an issue, but at least they're kind of quieting their voice. So those are more outcome-related indicators that often are more reflective of some of those longer-term goals and those policy goals that people are trying to achieve.
Awesome. One question that I can answer, which is whether we'll be able to send the presentation deck to participants after the webinar. Yes, we will share the slide deck as well as the recording, so you can feel free to share those with your colleagues. And then one last question, I think for Loren. Can you share some pro tips on helping organizations identify the pivotal actions that you talked about?
Share some tips about helping organizations identify the pivotal actions. I mean, I think one of the keys is, you have to be identifying metrics that the organizations themselves are tracking. So I think this is where sort of engaging with the grantees, and you can't just sort of come up with a set of metrics and then go to the grantees and say, this is what we want to know, because they may not be tracking that. It may be difficult for them to track it. They may not have capacity to do that. And then I think, understanding tactical activities that are salient and meaningful, you need to really understand what the strategy is. And I think that again requires a good conversation with grantees and some level of alignment on what the theory of change is, where the power lies on a particular issue, how they're hoping to sort of influence those levers of power, and then the sort of tactics flow from that. And I mean, I think often, unfortunately, a lot of groups sort of come up with a tactical plan without doing a larger power analysis of an issue and understanding, how who the decision makers are and what are the sort of necessary levers for influencing those folks. So that sort of larger strategy and understanding and power analysis is sort of critical to then identifying tactics that can move the needle, and then that in turn is sort of what you want to be measuring in the interim.
Thank you both. That's it for questions for now. So I think we can continue and then we'll have more time for Q&A later.
Okay, so we're going to transition back to Loren to talk about, well, actually we're going to do this as a tag team, but we're going to talk about best practices in methodologies. And so I had already alluded to some of this in the conversation about indicators. So quantitative methods can be incredibly helpful, and so can qualitative. And we are always using a mix of these methodologies in order to evaluate advocacy. As you might imagine, in many respects, we tend to use more quantitative methods for tactical outputs in order to reflect what happened. And we use qualitative methods that we need to help understand why and how something happens. So that's how we tend to think about qualitative and quantitative methods. By no stretch does that mean that quantitative methods can't help to understand how things occurred, but generally speaking, we rely on qualitative methodology to figure that out. We also find that the qualitative piece can be incredibly helpful to understand that context as well, particularly from the point of view of folks outside of the funding community and outside of those organizations that are funded. Another best practice from our perch is engaging advocates in defining metrics. So we talked a little bit about this in the examples before, where the foundation had offered technical assistance to grantee partners in order to help them to define the metrics that made sense for them as well as for the larger foundation. And one of the types of, some of the questions that we ask when we're engaging in those advocacy organizations is, what data do they already collect? What can they collect? And if they need to do any new data collection, what kinds of capacities and what kinds of resources would they need to do that? And also, we're also looking for those metrics that are most salient to the policy outcomes that are trying to be achieved. So these are some of the questions that we ask as we engage advocates when we define metrics with them. And Loren's going to provide an example of this for us.
Yeah, I mean, I think the example I wanted to talk about really illustrates the importance of engaging advocate expertise. So just want to return to an example I gave earlier about voter registration. And I'd said that there's a lot of funders that support voter registration aimed at increasing electoral participation amongst different communities, and they're very focused on the cost per voter registration. And that has sort of that point of emphasis really pushed that in the field. And advocates know that the cost to register someone can really vary according to who you're targeting. It costs more to register somebody who's never registered before or voted before, who's sort of a hard-to-reach voter, than it does to register somebody who's previously voted and been registered, maybe moved and needs to re-register. And so I think comparing the cost of registration sort of between those two groups is like comparing apples to oranges. But some funders kind of assume that all voters are equal and really just wanted to support voter registration drive that had the lowest cost per voter registration. And that sort of created the consequence of groups being incentivized to register the easiest to reach and easiest to register voters, including people who moved and didn't just needed to re-register, which isn't necessarily serve the long-term goals that funders have of trying to increase electoral participation of the hardest to reach voters. So that's just an example of how it's important to really engage with grantees and advocates and tap their expertise as you're developing metrics to kind of understand the nuances of some of these metrics and the consequences of really focusing on one particular metric or another. Julie, are you there? Or are you?
Oh, I was on mute. Thank you, Loren. That happens.
It was a dramatic pause.
Conference calls. Yes. One of the other recommendations that we make is to be flexible, and we've been talking about flexibility throughout the presentation, essentially because it's being reactive to the dynamic and complex nature of advocacy. So we always recommend not to handcuff advocates to specific tactics, and this rings true for the evaluation. If you ask to build an evaluation plan, it's got a number of outputs and outcomes. Those might change over time, and giving organizations the opportunity to make mid-course corrections is essential, and we highly recommend it. We also suggest that funders focus on capacity building, not just policy outcomes. So when you think about evaluating advocacy, oftentimes the investments that you're making are helping the groups not only build a base, not only to add to a movement or create a movement, not just to win the issue, but those investments also often help to build the capacity and sustainability of those advocacy organizations. And so we recommend, and whenever we do advocacy evaluation, we think twice about whether or not the foundation should be considering assessing the capacity of those advocacy organizations over time. What kinds of effects did those investments have, not just on the policy issue, not just on the change that you wanted to see, but on the nature of those nonprofits. So again, I think Loren has a great example of this.
Yeah, and I think this is really a critical point because all funders who are trying to move issues through advocacy really depend on there being a strong infrastructure of advocacy organizations, a strong ecosystem, and funders are really tapping into the organizational strength, power, and capacity and leadership of organizations on the ground when they're trying to fund an advocacy campaign. So it's really important to that through advocacy campaigns, organizations are getting stronger and not weaker because these are really long-term efforts. The example that I'll give, the first organizing an advocacy campaign that I was part of was an organization called the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization, a community organizing group in Massachusetts, and was working on the issue of affordable housing, had gone to leaders in the state legislature in Massachusetts to seek increased state funding for affordable housing. And the leaders in the legislature basically said no. And so the leaders of the organization said, well, what would we need to do to persuade you? And they said, if you had 100,000 signatures, that would get our attention. And so the organization set out to gather these signatures, and this was sort of before online petitions, and this was going out onto the ground, shoe leather, going onto the corner, the street corner, into outside of supermarkets, et cetera, and getting the signatures. And we realized we had two different choices of how we could do this. We could pay paid canvassers to go and gather these signatures, and we thought that they could do that. We could get 100,000 signatures that way. It wouldn't really build up the capacity of the organization. Once we paid those canvassers, they would be gone. We'd have a bunch of signatures we could turn over. The second option was to train volunteers. This was a membership-based organization with a membership rooted in congregations and local kind of community-based organizations in the Metro Boston area. The other option was to build volunteer teams, train them, have those people gather the signatures, and if we did that, we'd have 100,000 signatures, plus we'd have scores of trained, committed, energized volunteers who were going to be working with the organization, long into the future on this campaign and on other campaigns. And so the organization, of course, chose to do the volunteer-driven model. But the point is, as a funder, if you're only measuring the policy outcome, you're looking at did they win the funding for affordable housing? You're not paying attention to the process, and the process is important. The process is what builds capacity for the long term. And so what you're measuring really makes a difference, and making sure that you're measuring not just these policy outcomes, but also capacity building metrics. Are organizations developing leadership? Are they developing skills? Are they recruiting more volunteers? All that is really important for the long term and for building up the sort of civic commons that every single funder really needs to tap into when they're trying to advance an issue through advocacy efforts.
And so with that, again, there are a number of best practices as we approach advocacy evaluation in our work, and I imagine that there are probably others that people would share or think about. But I think we want to take a pause and see if there are any additional questions. And I can't see any of the questions, Catherine, so I don't know if there are any.
Yeah, no other questions have come in, but if anyone has any, please feel free to type them into the questions box and I'll share.
Thanks. So I guess while we wait, let's kind of shift gears here, Loren. Loren, did you want to run through the framework?
Yeah, I can run through the framework, and then as questions come up, Catherine, let me know and we can pause. And so we wanted to share, just as a sort of final piece of this presentation, a framework that Arabella developed, which is a versatile tool and framework for developing and evaluating advocacy initiatives. we developed this framework that includes 7 components. We've identified 7 components of an enabling environment for successful advocacy. We actually this framework kind of drew from some work that the Redstone Strategy Group had done in an article that they wrote, and they had developed a framework for the enabling environment for successful advocacy, and we tested and amended their framework through interviews with practitioners and a review of other evaluation tools. And so let me just quickly run through the 7 components, and then we can talk about how we apply this framework. So first, in order to have an environment that's conducive to successful advocacy, you need to have a feasible policy solution. You want to know that before you launch an advocacy effort, that you know what the policy solution is that you want to achieve, and that it will achieve its intended benefits. It's actually going to solve the larger problem you want to solve. You need a compelling narrative, messaging that resonates broadly with the public and can inspire and help mobilize people. We saw, as an example, the movement for marriage equality gained significant momentum after it shifted its messaging from a rights-based frame to one that focused on the shared value of loving and committed relationships. So investing in kind of messaging research, deep messaging work to find out what really resonates with the public is a critical component. A strong advocacy capacity. Most successful advocacy initiatives are led by a cohort of core advocacy groups that are well aligned, that work together, that share, are aligned on goals, and that have the capacity to do communications work. They have a certain amount of research capacity. They have relationships with policymakers that they can tap, et cetera. You also need strong grassroots capacity. We've seen in a number of different campaigns and initiatives that really relied heavily on grass tops leadership. We've seen those efforts falter, particularly when it's an issue that galvanizes a pretty powerful opposition. And when there's strong grassroots on the opposition side of the issue, it's even more critical to have strong grassroots infrastructure on your side. Diverse and influential allies, particularly in the current political environment, it's increasingly important to be able to build out coalitions that have the ability to have some bipartisan influence. And so some unusual and unlikely allies in the mix is pretty critical. And then most successful advocacy efforts depend on kind of an inside and outside game. You need strong champions inside government pushing an issue, as well as a strong coalition of groups pushing from the outside. And then lastly, you need a plan and resources and a vision for implementation. This is an area that's sort of often neglected. A lot of money goes into the campaigns and efforts to pass and enact policies, and then it often sort of gets cut off or slows to a trickle, after the policy is enacted, but there can be a lot of challenges with implementation. If there isn't good take-up, there's often sort of political backlash, things can start falling apart. And we've seen that quite a bit on healthcare, where tens of millions of dollars went into passing the Affordable Care Act. There are much fewer resources available to support its implementation, and that created challenges. And then we use this framework. This framework can be used in a variety of ways. We've used it to conduct landscape analysis around an issue to be able to determine, is there a strong enabling environment around this issue? Is it an issue that's ripe for success? Or to look at different states and to assess and analyze which states are kind of most ripe for investment, where there's the greatest potential to be successful. We've used it to develop grant-making strategies. So once you do the analysis, you understand better the landscape and what areas of the enabling environment are strong and which are weaker, and you can therefore target your grant-making resources to the areas that need to be strengthened. And lastly, it's a tool that can help inform evaluation projects. The 7 components themselves can inform metrics used to measure interim progress. And again, understanding that the ultimate policy outcomes can often be take a long time to occur, and you need interim measures. Those 7 components are areas that you can be looking at to measure progress in the interim. It can also be used to evaluate why an advocacy initiative may have failed, to understand which areas of the enabling environment may have been weaker and may have been sort of the cause of shortcomings in an advocacy initiative. So that's another framework, another tool that we have. We're happy to connect with people offline to talk more about it if that's useful. And I know we have a little less than 5 minutes left. I don't know if any more questions have come in, Catherine.
No new questions. Does anyone else have anything to ask? Yeah, nothing so far. I'll let you know.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks everyone for your attention and participation today. What we have on the screen now is a list of resources. If you get a copy of the deck, these are all hyperlinks, but these are some common publicly available resources that you can go to can spark ideas about the kinds of metrics that you might consider using when evaluating advocacy. We also mentioned Boulder Advocacy here. It's a great resource for advocacy organizations as well as funders to understand more about evaluating advocacy from the inside of an organization. And lastly, a great resource is the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy. So if there are no more questions, we can close out. Catherine, any more questions? Jump in.
No, nothing else, but thank you so much to both of you, Julie and Loren, and we look forward to continuing the conversation.
Great.
Great.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.